Good morning. Today I am coming to you from the little box up on the wall. And as I preach to you today, I want you to take some time to consider whether you can see and whether you can hear. We're going to be using more technology, a lot more video. I will be appearing in both churches, more through the screen, less in person. So it's important that the screen be big enough, that the sound be loud enough. If we need to buy bigger screens, we will. If we need to add external amplification and speakers, we will. If you can't see, if you can't hear, if you think things need to be bigger or louder, let me know, let the elders know. Don't just shrug it off. As we go into this new reality, we need to make it as comfortable and as easy as possible for everyone. And now to the sermon. All summer we've been honoring America's 250th anniversary by considering some of our country's first preachers, the sermons they preached, and the scriptures they preached on. Today we come to the most influential and perhaps the most American of them all. If you saw the movie The Great Awakening, he was a major character in that movie. It's the evangelist George Whitefield. Now, I have a special affinity for George Whitefield because I took my ordination vows standing directly over the tomb of George Whitefield. You see, George Whitefield is buried underneath the pulpit of Old South Presbyterian Church in Newburyport, Massachusetts. And I took my ordination vows standing in the pulpit of Old South Presbyterian Church in Newburyport, Massachusetts. We are connected, George Whitefield and I. Now, the funny thing is, George Whitefield, who's buried under the pulpit of a Presbyterian church, was not Presbyterian. Whitefield is also considered one of the founders of American Methodism, but he was not a Methodist. Historians say that Whitefield did as much, if not more than anyone, to unite the colonies against the British, but George Whitefield never once preached a political sermon, and he never renounced the king. And George Whitefield was perhaps the best preacher of any age, but he never served a congregation. Whitefield begins his sermon on Zacchaeus by diving straight into the Gospel of Luke. And Jesus said to him, Whitefield preached, him being Zacchaeus, "This day is salvation come to this house, for as much as he also is the son of Abraham. For the Son of Man is come to seek and to save that which is lost." Zacchaeus, the wee little man, the tax collector who climbs up in the sycamore tree for the Lord he wants to see. Let's read the whole story from Luke's Gospel, chapter 19. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through it. A man was there named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd, he could not, because he was short in stature. So Zacchaeus ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see Jesus, because Jesus was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to Zacchaeus, "Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today." So Zacchaeus hurried down and was happy to welcome Jesus. All who saw it began to grumble and said, "He has gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner." Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, "Look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much." Then Jesus said to Zacchaeus, "Today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost." Zacchaeus, the lost sinner, the chief among sinners, whom Jesus has come to Jericho specifically to seek out. Jesus, the finder of lost sheep, the Savior of lost souls. Whitefield preached this sermon from either a borrowed pulpit or out in a field, standing on a wagon or maybe a stump. Whitefield sees himself like Jesus, not Savior of the world like Jesus, but like Jesus as in being a traveling preacher, an object of curiosity and controversy, someone who journeys from town to town, colony to colony, from England to Scotland to Wales to America, crossing the Atlantic at least 11 times. One biographer estimated Whitefield spent 4 years of his life on boats in the North Atlantic Ocean, all to convince recalcitrant sinners to experience Christ's salvation. As Whitefield traveled from town to town, from colony to colony, he became America's first true national celebrity. He masterfully used the media to announce his arrival, to report on his preaching. He even generated fake controversies to increase media attention. He attracted thousands to his revival events, causing traffic jams and enormous dust clouds on the primitive roads. Collections of his sermons were bestsellers, making him and Benjamin Franklin, his publisher, incredibly rich. Whitefield's philanthropy was widely distributed, incredibly generous, and well publicized. Whitefield is Jesus, the traveling preacher saving lost souls. Zacchaeus was the individual sinner who perhaps that day, out of curiosity, had joined the thousands who had left their farms, closed up their shops to experience George Whitefield's dramatic and spellbinding preaching. Was Zacchaeus a good man, deserving of the Lord's attention? No. He was the worst of all sinners. he in no way deserves the Lord's attention. Yet, Jesus knows Zacchaeus before he even enters town. He calls Zacchaeus by name even though they have never met. Jesus may be passing through Jericho, but before he leaves town, there's one thing he must do. He must call Zacchaeus from the tree. He must abide in Zacchaeus' house. Zacchaeus is lost. Jesus must find him. Zacchaeus must be saved. Not only must Zacchaeus be saved, Whitefield tells us Zacchaeus was predestined to be saved that day. So Zacchaeus' salvation is assured, but Whitefield will also tell us his salvation was not complete until Zacchaeus gets down from the tree, welcomes Jesus into his house, declares Jesus as Lord, and responds to Christ's salvation through good works. And here, in a nutshell, this journey of getting down from the tree, welcoming Jesus into our house or our heart, declaring Jesus as Lord, and living the Christian life through good works, that is the blueprint for every revival preacher since, and is the underlying theology of American evangelicalism. Here we find that embedded in a 300-year-old sermon. And it's a good sermon. Of all the sermons that I've been reading and highlighting this summer, this sermon, Whitefield's sermon on Zacchaeus, is the only one I've even been tempted to preach word for word. It's long. You'd be hungry by the time it was over. But you could easily follow it and understand it. The pattern of Whitefield's words, his focus on the individual believer, and his call to personal salvation would be familiar to anyone who grew up listening to Billy Graham's sermons. In creating this new American theology, Whitefield borrows heavily from the Puritans, alludes to the emerging Methodists and their focus on sanctification or becoming holy through spiritual practice. But Whitefield weaves a middle course between the two, creating something unique and new. As Jesus walks into Jericho that day, he already knew Zacchaeus. He knew how much Zacchaeus had cheated. He knew how much Zacchaeus had stolen. He knew how Zacchaeus had spent all of his money on fine homes and great banquets. He knew Zacchaeus to be chief among sinners. And he knew the deep, dark hole in Zacchaeus' soul. Jesus knew all of that and still had decided to save Zacchaeus. To use the words of the Apostle Paul, Zacchaeus was predestined to be conformed to the image of Christ. Predestined to be saved on that day. Before Jesus walked into town, before Jesus called Zacchaeus from the tree, before Jesus invited himself to Zacchaeus' house. Note the action there. For George Whitefield, that's very, very important. Zacchaeus doesn't invite Jesus into his house. Jesus invites Zacchaeus into his house. Before Zacchaeus pledges to satisfy those he's defrauded and gives his fortune to the poor, Zacchaeus' salvation is assured. But if Zacchaeus is to benefit from his predestined salvation, and by benefit here, I'm not talking about getting into heaven. Heaven, according to the good Puritan theology Whitefield draws upon, is assured. Even before Jesus enters town, even before Jesus calls Zacchaeus' name. So when I talk about benefit, and at this point I'm preaching, I'm not reading to you from Whitefield. This is me preaching, but Whitefield and I are walking side by side on this one. After all, Whitefield's spirit did bless me as I took my vows to become minister of the gospel we both preach. So when I say benefit, I'm not talking about getting into heaven. By benefit, I'm talking about experiencing the joy of our salvation, the fullness of a life gifted to us by Jesus Christ. As Christians, we must respond to God's grace with a life devoted to Christ. We must let Christ be Lord of our lives. We must forgive as we have been forgiven. We must follow the example of Christ in our relationships with our neighbors. We must be willing to die to ourselves so we can be raised with Christ. We must be believers in the power of resurrection in the midst of a weary and a broken world. And we must, not because we need a checklist of good deeds to get us into heaven, we must live out our faith, because only then will the hole in our souls be filled. And only then will we receive the gift of participation in God's recreation. And what does a traveling preacher preaching a message of salvation using the story of Zacchaeus have to do with the forming of this country? On one hand, very little. As I said, Zacchaeus Whitefield never did anything publicly that was in any way political. But through Whitefield's incessant traveling, through his preaching, through his writing, by becoming an American celebrity, George Whitefield begins uniting the people in the colonies, from Georgia to Massachusetts, in a way that George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or any of the founding fathers ever could. And along the way, he would develop an American Christianity, not in that it is a Christianity that waves Americans' flag, but it is a Christianity that welcomes Methodists and Presbyterians and Church of England folk and Baptists and anyone else to follow Christ together and to live out their faith as a unified whole. Next week, I'll be back, and we will continue with a much more political preacher, a guy named David Griffith, who was George Washington's pastor and preached a sermon that swayed a vote in the Virginia legislature. So that's next week, and I'll be back, and I'll see you all then.